All right, let's dive right in. Today we're tackling transcendentalism, and because you're a philosopher, you're in for a treat. We've got historical stuff, philosophical arguments, even some juicy biographical bits.
Yeah, what's really cool is Transcendentalism wasn't just, poets writing about pretty flowers. This was a major philosophical shift happening in America in the early 1800s. These guys, they were dealing with huge questions about truth, intuition, how we even experience the world. Heavy stuff.
It seems like it all started with Unitarianism, right?
Oh,
At least that's what our sources point to as kind of the jumping off point.
Unitarianism was like the liberal religious scene back then. It was a pushback against that strict Calvinism that had been so dominant in early America. So Unitarians, they emphasized reason, human potential, and they believed in one God, not the Trinity. A big departure for the time. And they tried to blend like Locke's empiricism with Christianity.
So they were trying to find some middle ground between faith and reason, much like a lot of philosophers have tried to do over the centuries.
Exactly. But this blending, this compromise, that's what the Transcendentalists really pushed back against. They wanted a whole new path, not just some middle ground.
And that path, surprisingly, seems to be influenced by David Hume. The sources talk about Emerson being fascinated with Hume's skepticism, even testing those arguments out on his very religious aunt. Why is this significant for a philosopher like our listener?
Now, this is where it gets really interesting for a philosopher like you. Hume, right? He argued that we can never truly know cause and effect. We just see things happen over and over and assume a connection. Emerson, he found this deeply unsettling, especially when it came to religious belief. It made him wonder, like, if we can't even be certain the sun's going to rise tomorrow, how can we be certain about anything beyond our immediate experience?
So Hume's radical doubt, is that what planted the seed for transcendentalism?
You could say that, yeah. Hume's skepticism, combined with a growing trend of biblical criticism at the time, it pushed them to search for a different basis for knowledge and belief. They turned to individual intuition, direct experience, a radical move away from blind faith, A&D, just relying on empirical observation.
And then, to make things even more complex, you have German idealism entering the American intellectual scene. The sources mention figures like Frederick Henry Hedge and James Marsh bringing these ideas over from Europe.
Oh, absolutely. Hedge was key in starting the Transcendental Club. Think of it like a 19th century philosophy club where all these radical ideas were being debated and refined.
So what was it about figures like Kant that so resonated with these transcendentalists? Kant's work is super complex, even for a seasoned philosopher.
Yeah, Kant's transcendental idealism is definitely dense, but it offered a framework that really clicked with where the transcendentalists were already headed. He argued that the mind isn't just passively taking in information, it's actively shaping our experience through these inherent categories of understanding. So the empirical world is still important, but it's filtered through the lens of our individual perception.
So in a way, it was like a philosophical Copernican revolution, shifting the focus from the object to the subject, from the outside world to the world inside our mind.
Exactly. They weren't throwing reason out the window, but they were saying, look, just observing things has its limits. Individual insight, intuition, those are crucial ways of knowing too. And this emphasis on individual experience, that's what really set the stage for their social and political critiques.
Yeah, our sources definitely highlight their growing unease with things like slavery, the displacement of Native Americans, the Mexican War.
If your own intuition and conscience are what matter most, then blindly obeying unjust laws becomes, well, morally impossible. Figures like Emerson and Thoreau, they saw a huge gap between America's ideals and how it was actually behaving. And that pushed them to speak out, even when it meant being ostracized.
You can really feel that moral urgency in their writing, this sense that something was deeply wrong at the core of American society. And then, of course, there's John Brown, a figure who took these ideas to a very radical, a very controversial conclusion.
John Brown, he was a real lightning rod. He believed that violence was justified to fight slavery, and his actions, the raid on Harper's Ferry, even divided the Transcendentalists themselves.
So how did Emerson and Thoreau, these champions of individual conscience, respond to someone like Brown, who acted on his conscience in such a dramatic and violent way?
It's fascinating to see how their philosophies wrestled with this real-world dilemma. Thoreau, he passionately defended Brown, called him a, quote, transcendentalist above all. While Emerson was more torn, he admired Brown's courage but questioned whether his methods would actually work. It's this tension between ideals and action, between personal conscience and all the complexities of society, that makes transcendentalism so relevant even now.
It's definitely more than just pretty poems about nature. It's a philosophy that grapples with these fundamental questions of how we should live in a world full of injustice and moral gray areas.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so compelling, especially for a philosopher like you. These weren't just ivory tower intellectuals. They were trying to figure out how to live ethically in a world that often seemed to reward just going along with things and staying silent when you see injustice. And their engagement with German idealism, that's particularly interesting for a philosopher. They saw in Kant, and even guys like Coleridge and Schelling, a way to say the human mind is powerful, but without needing all that traditional religious dogma.
It's like they were trying to bridge this gap between reason and intuition, the material world and like the spiritual realm. Classic philosophical struggle, right?
Oh, absolutely. And philosophers are still wrestling with that today. How do we square our subjective experience with what's objectively out there? What role does intuition play in how we understand reality? These are the questions the Transcendentalists were grappling with. And their insights, well, they offer some really valuable perspectives, even for today's philosophical discussions.
One thing that strikes me is how they were so individualistic, emphasizing self-reliance and personal experience, but at the same time, super passionate about social justice and reform. How do those two things even go together?
You've hit on a really key part of Transcendentalist thought. They believed that for someone to truly be fulfilled as an individual, society as a whole had to be doing well. Injustice and oppression weren't just problems out there, they were roadblocks for everyone's progress, individually and collectively.
So it wasn't about escaping the world and creating some isolated utopia.
Not at all. True self-reliance for them, that meant being engaged with the world, challenging injustice, and actively working towards a more just and equal society. Their critiques of things like slavery, materialism, conformity, those weren't just abstract ideas, they were calls to action.
Their writings are full of these passionate critiques. They seem to have this unshakable belief in humanity's potential to achieve something better. Where did that optimism even come from?
They had this deep faith in the power of human intuition, that our moral conscience could guide us to a better future. The idea of an oversoul, a universal spirit that connects everything, that really captures their belief in the inherent goodness and potential for, like, divinity within each person. For them, everyone was capable of spiritual growth and enlightenment.
And they definitely weren't afraid to put their beliefs into action, even when it meant going against the grain and being criticized. Like Thoreau refusing to pay taxes to protest the Mexican War and slavery. That was a bold move.
Absolutely. Their actions really showed how committed they were to living their philosophy, even when it meant personal sacrifice. They didn't just talk about morality and justice, they felt a moral obligation to act.
That willingness to challenge the norm, to walk the walk, that's what makes their philosophy so powerful, even today.
I agree. In a world that often feels so cynical and apathetic, the Transcendentalists' belief in individual conscience and the possibility of changing society, that's a pretty powerful antidote. Their writings remind us that each of us has a role to play in building a more just and meaningful world.
Their impact on American literature and culture, you can't deny it.
Oh, of course. Transcendentalism had a huge and lasting impact on American literature. It shaped the work of writers like Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Louisa May Alcott, just to name a few.
That emphasis on individual experience, celebrating nature, exploring themes of self-reliance and nonconformity, you can see that throughout American literature, even in contemporary works.
And their influence goes beyond just literature. Their ideas have shaped American art, music, social movements, from the abolitionist movement all the way to the environmental movement.
It's amazing to think that a small group of intellectuals in 19th century New England could have such a big impact on American culture.
It really shows the power of ideas, especially when they're rooted in a deep commitment to individual freedom, social justice, and trying to find meaning in a world that can often feel kind of empty.
Their legacy continues to inspire us to think critically, to fight against injustice, and to live lives that are both authentic and purposeful.
Absolutely. The Transcendentalists' message is as relevant today as it was almost 200 years ago.
I'm really curious about their views on nature's role in shaping our thoughts and experiences. It pops up a lot in their work.
Nature was a core part of their thinking. They saw it not just as beautiful and inspiring, but also as a way to connect with that oversoul they talked about so much. It was a manifestation of the divine.
Emerson, he famously described himself as a, quote, transparent eyeball in nature, totally immersed in the experience. What do you think he meant by that?
He was trying to describe that feeling of being completely absorbed, losing yourself in the wonder of nature. For Emerson, you didn't just observe nature, you experienced it. It was a source of deep spiritual insight and a way to feel renewed.
And for Thoreau, nature wasn't just something to admire, it was something to experience firsthand, to live in and learn from. His time at Walden Pond really showed that.
Exactly. His Walden experiment was like a philosophical test to see how far self-reliance could go and to explore a simpler, more authentic way of life. His writing is full of these amazing descriptions of nature, and he uses those descriptions to explore these deeper philosophical and ethical questions.
It's interesting because for so many of us today, that direct connection to nature is kind of lost. We're caught up in technology, city life. We forget how important it is to spend time in the natural world.
Mhm.
Do you think the Transcendentalists have something to teach us about that?
I think they have a lot to teach us. Their emphasis on nature's ability to heal and transform, well, it might be even more relevant today than it was back then.
What would you say is the most important lesson we can learn from them about our relationship with nature?
They remind us to slow down, pay attention to the world around us, and reconnect with nature. They understood that to truly be well, we need a harmonious relationship between ourselves and the natural world.
We've talked about their philosophy, their activism, their love for nature. But what about their impact on religion? They weren't shy about criticizing traditional religious institutions.
Yeah, that's another fascinating aspect of Transcendentalism. They challenge the usual doctrines and institutions, pushing for a more personal and experiential approach to spirituality. They weren't atheists, but they rejected the rigid dogma and hierarchies of organized religion.
So they wanted a more individualistic, intuitive approach to spirituality.
Exactly. They believed in a direct, intuitive connection to the divine, without needing priests or scriptures. They often use the term oversoul to describe this universal spirit that was present in everything. They saw Jesus not as a divine savior, but as a wise teacher, someone who showed what humans were truly capable of.
This idea of a universal spirituality that anyone can access, regardless of what religion they belong to, that was pretty radical for the time.
Totally. It challenged the religious norms and paved the way for new kinds of spiritual expression, and their emphasis on personal experience and intuition that had a huge influence on later religious movements, like Unitarian Universalism and New Thought.
So their legacy goes beyond just philosophy and literature.
Absolutely. Their ideas have influenced how we think about spirituality, about the individual's role in society, about our relationship with nature.
We've covered a lot here. For our listener, a fellow philosopher, what would you say are the key takeaways about Transcendentalism?
Well, Transcendentalism was a complex movement, touching on a whole range of topics: philosophical, religious, social, political. It was a reaction to the intellectual and cultural shifts happening in the early 19th century, and it offered a unique and lasting vision for creating a more just and meaningful world.
So to sum up, they were deeply individualistic, yet super engaged with society. They were critical of traditional institutions, but optimistic about what humans could achieve. They embraced reason, but also valued intuition. And they believed in a spiritual reality that went beyond just the material world.
Exactly. They were complex thinkers, wrestling with some of the biggest questions about what it means to be human. And their ideas, they continue to challenge and inspire us today.
This has been a really stimulating conversation. I feel like I understand the complexities and nuances of transcendentalist thought much better now.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a fascinating subject that deserves a lot of thought and study.
And I think it's especially relevant for philosophers today, because we're dealing with many of the same questions about the nature of reality, the role of intuition, and the relationship between individuals and society.
Absolutely. The Transcendentalists offer a really rich and nuanced perspective on these big philosophical questions that never really go away.
You know, one thing that sticks with me is their emphasis on living a deliberate and authentic life.
Yeah, that's a central theme in their work. They believed everyone had a unique purpose to fulfill, and that living in line with that purpose was essential to a meaningful life.
They encouraged us to question societal norms, trust our gut feelings, and find our own path, even if it's different from what everyone else is doing.
Exactly. They reminded us that real fulfillment doesn't come from fitting in with everyone else's expectations, but from listening to your own inner compass.
And that's a message that's timeless. It applies to everyone.
I completely agree. It goes beyond 19th century America and speaks to something fundamental about being human.
What are your thoughts on their views on education? I know they had strong opinions about how education should work and what its goals should be.
Their ideas about education were actually pretty progressive for their time. They thought education should be more than just memorizing facts. They saw it as a process of self-discovery and personal growth, something that should encourage critical thinking, creativity, and a love of learning.
It sounds like they were pushing for a more holistic approach to education, something that nurtures the whole person, not just their intellect.
That's a great way to put it. They also emphasize learning from experience and from nature, not just from books. They thought of nature as this vast classroom full of lessons about life, beauty, and how everything is connected.
And they believed that real education should prepare people to be active citizens, able to make society better.
Yeah, they saw education as a tool for social progress, a way to build a more just and equal world.
I think their views on education are still relevant today,
hmm
especially now when education is often seen as just a way to get a good job.
I agree. The Transcendentalists remind us that education should be about more than just getting a job. It should be about developing the whole person, encouraging a love of learning, and preparing people to be thoughtful, compassionate, and engaged citizens.
So we've explored their philosophy, their social and political views, their love of nature, their impact on religion, and their ideas about education. Do you think we've captured the essence of Transcendentalism?
I think we've only just dipped our toes into this rich and complex intellectual tradition, but we have touched on some of the main themes, thinkers, and the historical context that shaped the movement.
And hopefully we've piqued our listeners' curiosity to explore the writings of Emerson, Thoreau, Fuller, and the other Transcendentalists.
Yes, there's nothing like reading their work directly to really appreciate how profound and beautiful their ideas were.
I have one last question before we wrap up this part of our deep dive. Considering how much Transcendentalism influenced American thought, what would you say is its most lasting legacy?
That's a great question. I think their most enduring legacy is the unwavering belief in the power of the individual to shape their own destiny, but also the course of history. The Transcendentalists reminded us that we're not just passive observers, but active participants. We can make choices that matter, and we can help build a more just and meaningful future.
That's a powerful message, and one that's just as relevant today as it was back then.
Absolutely. And it's something we all need to hear, especially in a world that can feel overwhelming, like things are beyond our control.
Well said. We'll be right back after a short break to continue our exploration of Transcendentalism. Okay, we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Transcendentalism. It's been a fascinating journey so far, really exploring the depths of this movement.
It has. And it's always great to explore these rich philosophical ideas, especially with a fellow philosopher like yourself.
As we start to wind down, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. Thinking about the Transcendentalists' emphasis on individual intuition and conscience, how could those ideas be applied to the ethical and political debates we're having today?
That's a great question, and one that really gets to the heart of why Transcendentalism is still relevant. These thinkers, they were so engaged in the social and political issues of their time, always pushing for a better world.
So how could their ideas inform how we approach modern problems like climate change, social justice, or political polarization?
Well, they remind us that individual conscience and moral responsibility are paramount. They believe that we each have a duty to act according to our own inner compass, even if it means challenging the status quo or facing unpopular opinions.
So it's not just about blindly following rules or accepting authority, but about using critical thinking and making our own ethical decisions.
Exactly. For the Transcendentalists, true morality came from a deep understanding of your own values and principles. They encouraged people to act on those values, even when it's hard.
They also stressed how interconnected everything is, both in nature and in human society.
Right. Their idea of the oversoul suggests this unity that goes beyond our individual differences, connecting us all on a deeper level. And that has huge implications for how we deal with social and political issues. It encourages us to see ourselves as part of this bigger web of relationships with responsibilities to each other and to the planet.
In a world that feels increasingly divided, the Transcendentalists offer this vision of unity and interconnectedness. They remind us that our actions have consequences that reach far beyond ourselves, affecting others and the environment we live in.
Exactly. They challenge us to think beyond our own self-interest and consider the bigger picture of our choices. It's not just about what's in it for me, it's what kind of world am I helping to create?
And they remind us how important it is to connect with nature, for inspiration, for renewal, and for ethical guidance.
Their writings are full of vivid descriptions of nature. They didn't see nature as just a pretty backdrop. It was a reflection of the divine, a source of wisdom and moral insight.
They believed that spending time in nature could foster wonder, humility, and a deeper understanding of our place in the universe.
And in our modern world, dominated by technology and city life, that message is probably even more important than ever. They encourage us to slow down, pay attention to the world around us, and rediscover nature as a source of both beauty and ethical guidance.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive into transcendentalism. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, but I hope we've given our listeners a solid starting point for further exploration.
I agree. The Transcendentalists were such complex and nuanced thinkers, and their ideas still spark debate and inspire new ways of thinking. I encourage you to dive into their writings and see for yourself how rich and relevant their thoughts are, even today.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep those minds curious and those ideas flowing.